How do you structure a full stack application? The wonderful thing about Express is that it gives us a lot of flexibility. And in this video, I'd like to show you how I structure a Express application. Let's get started. Starting out, I start with 4 folders. First, the client folder for the front-end code. Next is the data folder for all of your SQL for your database. Next, I do a dev folder for any scripts, or I also put testing in here if you need to do unit tests. And then last but not least, a server folder, which runs the actual server, the Express application. Next, let's go into the terminal. We'll come in here, we'll run npm init. I'm assuming that you have Node.js installed on your computer. If you don't, I'll put a link in the description below for how to install that. We'll go ahead and run this. And it's going to ask you a bunch of questions on how to configure your application. You also can just hit enter a bunch of times, but you can also fill out things. Like, for example, the author, you could say, I'll put my name, for example. Yeah, that's fine. This will create a package.json file, which describes your application on a high level. The name of the application, the version, a description of the application, what does it do? The main file, we're going to come in here and we're going to say server/server.js. In my opinion, I want all my server code to live in that server folder. Then in the scripts part, we're going to get rid of this test, and we'll come in here and we'll do start. We'll come in here, we'll say node server/server.js. Let's go ahead and we'll install our dependencies. So down here in the terminal, we'll come in here, we'll do npm install ExpressJS PG and Morgan as well. We'll install other ones as we go, but we'll start out with that. Let's go ahead and we'll hit enter. Now, if you're not using a database, obviously you don't need to install PG. But generally speaking, I always start with Express and then some kind of server-side rendering like EJS. And then Morgan is the logger. So it'll actually log everybody that connects to our server. Let's come in here and this will create a package.lock.json file. Don't touch this file. Let npm kind of handle this. It also creates a node modules folder, which is all of your dependencies, the code that you rely upon, like Express, is all inside of there. Okay, let's come in here and we'll go into our server folder. And inside the server, I create a modules folder. I create a routes folder. And I also create a core folder. And the core folder is going to be the central server code. My goal is to be able to copy paste this core folder and put it into a whole different project. It's going to have a bunch of JavaScript that just sets up a standard Express application. I'm going to run you through all that. The modules folder are different components of your application. So in this example with a productivity application, one of our modules is going to be a account logging in service that we'll use to log in and log out and create accounts, etc. Another one is going to be the planner portion of our application, which will let you set daily plans and weekly plans, etc. Another part will be the private wiki, which will allow you to view different pages, edit those pages, etc. You could think of the modules folder as different departments of your application. So if I'm thinking of a restaurant, for example, one department might be the office, right? The main administration of everything. And then the next one might be the kitchen. And another one might be the actual dining room, right? In a simple ExpressJS application, you might just have one module. And in that case, you might not even create a modules folder. But if you want to separate out your application, I highly recommend creating some kind of modules folder. Some people also create a services folder. I personally don't. I just like to keep it simple. All of the logical parts of the application I like to do in the modules folder. The routes folder you could think of as the forward-facing kind of part of the application. Going with our restaurant analogy, if you walk into a restaurant, the waiter or waitress or the host or hostess is the route. Or if you go through a fast food restaurant, they take your order. The route by which the customer goes through is they either go through the drive-through and they take your order, or they come in and they take the order, or whichever. Those are different routes that you can access the server, right? Those are different ways in which somebody can be served by the server. And they're different from modules in that the customer probably is never in the kitchen. That's how you can kind of think about it, right? When you're designing a web application, the person connecting to your website is never going to be in the database. You can think of the routes as sort of the public facing way, or routes that people can connect to your server. And then you can think of modules as different departments of your web application. And many of these modules are slightly more private in their implementation, more of the internals of how the server works. In the client folder, let's come in here and we'll create a public folder for all of our JavaScripts, style sheets, etc. Inside of here, we're going to create a image folder, a CSS folder, and then a JS folder for any of our JavaScripts. Next, in the client folder, we're also going to create a views folder, and this is where all of our HTML is going to live, except for it's not exactly HTML. We're going to put EJS files in there, and EJS files sort of become HTML. They sort of are the instructions for creating an HTML page, which we'll get into in the next video. The next video will go over server-side rendering. The data folder, I don't really do anything with it until we have different modules, and then I create folders for generally each one of those modules if I need it. Same thing with the dev folder. With the dev folder, I might do a test folder, and I might also do a scripts folder here. But not necessarily, not always the case. It's generally a little bit more loose, but this dev folder is more of, a bunch of tools that you can use as you need them. That won't necessarily be included with the application itself. So let's come in here and we'll go into our server folder and we'll create a server.js file. And this will be the main entry point of our application. This will be where it all starts. And when we run our application, it's going to come in here in the server.js file. Inside of the core folder, we're going to create two JavaScript files. We'll create a app.js and also a config.js file. The app.js file is going to basically set up our Express application, and I'm going to give you some standard boilerplate code that you can use basically in any Express application, and you can modify it to your needs. Let's come over here and we're going to import Express. Next, we're also going to import Morgan. Morgan is that logger that will tell us sort of the activity that's happening with our server. The way I like to do it is I like to have two functions, one for creating a Express application and the other one for running that Express application. In between calling these, you'll set up all of your routes that you'll use for the application. Come in here and create a new web application simply by calling Express. Next, we're going to set our view engine to EJS. And we're also going to tell it that we want all of our views to be in this client views folder here. So all of our EJS files will live there. Next, when people send data to your server, you need a way to parse it. You need a way to read it. And there's different formats that you can send data. The two that we're going to support are JSON and URL encoded. These essentially, you could think of this like if somebody sends your business a letter, you want some kind of process for opening that letter and reading it and making sense of it. And it's the same thing here. If somebody creates an account and they send, the username and password that they want for the new account, your server needs to be able to read that information, to be able to parse it and understand, oh, there's a username in here and there's a password in here that they sent to us. Next, we need a way to serve our JavaScript and our CSS, the client-side JavaScript and then CSS images, any other kind of file that you'll want to statically serve. And we're going to say that it's in the client and public folder. And last but not least, we're going to return our Express application. We will come back to this function. I like to have it this way because a lot of these in generally any Express application that you do, you'll probably do these. So I think it's quite useful just to have a nice function that does that. So then the other thing too is the configuration for the server. what we can have is we can have just one file that gives us all of the information about how the server exactly should run, like the port that it should use or database connection information and stuff. You don't want to put that kind of stuff in the in your code. So there's a couple options that you have. Now, one thing I'll also mention too with this config.js file is that it also depends on how you deploy it. If you're just deploying a Node.js application to a server that you sort of control, then you can use this. In some configuration methods, or if you're using Docker or something like that, you might want to use environment variables instead to do your configuration. That being said, though, I'm going to run you through creating a JSON file, that configuration for your application. Up at the top, we're going to import FS. That stands for file system. So that loads and saves and does anything on your computer like that. Next, we're going to load a file called server.config.json using this encoding here too, so that we know what it is. That'll basically load it as a string. And last but not least, we're going to parse that JSON so that it's an actual JavaScript object. Jump back into app.js. We're going to import our load config file that we did earlier. And next, at the very beginning of everything, we're actually going to set a sort of global variable called config. Here's what's amazing about Express is that when you do app.set, you're setting some kind of a variable that the application is going to keep track of called config, and it's going to be whatever this is. So you can just, we're going to load that JSON configuration file for how it should set up and everything, and just set it to a variable called config, and then you can reference it whenever you want. Last but not least, right after the views, we're going to set up our logger. Basically, what this is going to do is it's going to run our Morgan middleware. Middleware, you could think of as something that happens in the middle of the process of doing something. Going back to our fast food example, you run through a drive-through, and your goal is to get food. But in the middle of that, they take your order. That is an example of middleware. Essentially, some kind of process that happens before you actually are served by the server, essentially. So what we're doing here is before anything gets served, we're going to log that somebody connected to our server, and then we'll serve them, right? And this is great because it'll basically log all of the activity on your server. So if anybody's connecting or whatever, you can actually see everything that's going on. So now that we've done this, let's come in here. We'll go to our app.run file. So what this does is once the application is fully set up and you've added all your routes, we're going to run this app.run file. So let's get the configuration that we loaded earlier. Next, we're going to call a function called app.listen. This will actually listen on a specific port on the computer, given the configuration port that you have here. Again, if you're deploying this to something, you may not necessarily be able to choose the port that you're using, and you might have to do the following. You might have to do like process.env.port or something and use that instead. Or even optionally, you can come in here and do that. And if there's an environment variable, use that instead. Otherwise, use this thing. But for the sake of this video, we're not going to go into that. But just know that when you're deploying, you should look at the documentation for whatever you're using and how they want you to deploy it. But for now, we're going to use the port number that we have in our configuration. Let's come in here and we'll do our curly brackets and we'll hit enter. And last but not least, what I like to do is log out where it's actually listening on. So we have our server listening on, and then we have HTTP localhost. Localhost means yourself. It means your own computer, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. We do a colon, and then whatever the port is that we have in our configuration, we're going to put right there. When you run your application, this will give you a nice message that you can just click on and get right to your server. Let's go ahead and we're going to add our first route. Let's go to new file, and we're going to create an index.js file. Our index route you could think of as the front desk of a building that you walk into. The index router is going to have things like the home page. Let's come in here and we're going to import routers from Express. Next, we're going to create our index router by calling the following, and we'll export it so it can be used in other files. Next, we're going to create our route for the home page. So this will listen for anybody that connects to the very top of our application, the very top of our website. And we're going to run some function here. This is a request, and this is a response. Inside of this curly brackets, we'll go ahead and hit enter. We're going to respond, RES, with sending some data called hello. And like I said, in the next video, we are going to get into rendering templates and sort of how I do that. I'd love to show you that. But for now, what this will do is when somebody connects to our homepage, it's simply going to just send hello back to them. Let's go into our server.js file. Inside of here, we're going to import our two functions that we did, app create and app run. We're also going to import our index router. And here we go. Here's our server.js file. The reason I like to do an app create and app run is that it makes this sort of entry point file really clean. Again, the point though is you don't have to exactly organize it the way that I have, but this is just how I prefer. It makes it nice because you can copy paste this entire core folder into something and then just start developing your application very quickly. Two more things. Let's jump into package.json. And we're going to change the type to module because we're using imports and exports everywhere. Last thing that we're going to do is let's create a server.config.json file. In this server.config file, let's come in here and we'll create a port, and we'll set the port to 300. Also, if you're using Git, now is a good time to add this git ignore file to our project. Let's ignore node modules, as well as ignore the server.config.json file. Later in these videos, we're going to put the credentials for the database and such in that server.config.json file. We'll ignore it now, just so that it doesn't get committed to Git. Let's now come in here and we'll jump into the terminal, and let's go ahead and we'll run npm start and hit enter. And there we go, the server is running. Let's go ahead. You can hover your mouse over it and hold down Control and click it, or on a Mac you can hold down Command and click it. And there we go. It sent us hello. Perfect. This right here is the overall structure that I do for a Node.js application. In the next video, we're going to cover server-side rendering with EJS. I have a couple tricks that I use that I think makes it just a lot easier to work with. One final note that I'll have for you is you might be taking a course in university or going through a coding bootcamp or something like that, and they may dictate the structure of how you use an application. Or in addition, if you work somewhere, they may also dictate how an application is structured. But for your own projects, you obviously have a lot more freedom. And that's one of the great things about Express is that you have that freedom to be able to really kind of structure your application how you want. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.